I bought my first property at 20, and it all started with me selling homemade spam musubi and snacks out of a backpack every day before class. Everyone assumes I had family money, some kind of high salary, or family inheritance. I had none of that. And I'm telling you that because that season, the savings, being off social media, the years of sacrifice shaped the way I think about money, discipline, and leverage, and it still influences my decisions today. In this video, I'm going to walk you through how I went from cooking rice and spam every day before school to buying my first home at 20. But what I want to tell you is what I was actually learning, because at the time, I didn't understand it. My first real entrepreneurial thing was not an app or a brand or some perfect side hustle everyone would brag about online. It was food. And I learned the business by doing it. I learned timing. If I got to school early enough, I could get a head start before class, so I'd make more musubi that day. If I had sports after school, I knew I didn't have to rush to sell because I had the after-school crowd. I learned urgency too. Musubi gets soggy if it sits too long, so lunch was my peak hour. I had to make my rounds, move quickly, and sell as much food as I could before it lost its quality. So I would start high beginning of the day, and I'd lower my prices. I sold to students, teachers, deans, and somehow never got in trouble. Most days I would also sell fried Oreos, sometimes cake pops, because everyone has a sweet tooth, and that's how I learned margin. And at the time, I didn't realize I was learning demand, timing, and customer psychology. I just knew that it worked. I just knew that if I made something people wanted, showed up consistently, used my selling strategies, I could keep earning. Then I was starting college, and I got a job in the medical field because of a family friend, and I was getting paid well for my age. The important part, though, was not the fact that I made money, it was the fact that I barely spent it. My life was ramen and Pop-Tarts. For about 3 years, I lived very quietly. I was in a long-term relationship. I wasn't on social media. I was not trying to be everywhere or follow every trend or road trip or festival. To be honest, if I was paying for dinner, it was ramen. I had a sticky note on my mirror with a goal written on it so I could see it every single day. And the goal was simple. It was a dollar amount that kept going up so I could buy my first home. I even remember having a spreadsheet so I could track every single dollar spent, even if it was $10 on boba. If I spent $10, I knew I had to make $20 back. Not because $10 was going to ruin my life, but when you're trying to build your first real base of capital, you start realizing that every dollar counts. The boba calculation was never really about boba. It was about asking myself, does this put me a step back, or do I need to work harder to get there sooner? That season was not glamorous, but it gave me something more valuable than attention. It gave me traction. And then everything changed. Not in a bad way, in a way where sometimes life moves you somewhere better than where you were trying to go. At the time, I was living in California and looking at properties. Then COVID happened. My life shifted and I decided to move to Vegas to be closer to family. And honestly, Vegas made more sense. Property values were more realistic compared to what I was seeing in California. I didn't want to spend on a rundown home with high HOA just to say I owned it in California. I had saved around $50,000, which was a lot to me at the time, but more importantly, it meant when the right opportunity showed up, I wasn't calculating, I was ready to move, and that's exactly what I did. That first property ended up doing very well for me when I sold it, and that was one of the first lessons I learned in real estate. The purchase matters, but the exit matters too. And that first property wasn't the whole story, it was just the beginning of how I started learning real estate in real life. Since then, I have been a landlord, manager, flipper, realtor, and each lesson has taught me something different about money, psychology, and timing. If there was one thing I wanted a younger person to understand, is that your first base of capital is usually the hardest to build, but it's the most important. It's hard to save your first $10,000. It's hard to save your first $100,000. The beginning can feel painfully slow because you're mostly relying on discipline, income, and restraint. But once you have capital, skills, relationships, and a better understanding, things can compound faster over time, and opportunities will eventually present themselves. And scams. And the younger you are, the more you have a head start. And that has been true in my own life. I kept buying and selling, I became a landlord, I flipped homes, I've made all the mistakes you can think of. And now at 28, I'm working on larger projects and negotiating partnerships that would have felt very far away from the version of me selling food in school. What people usually see is the visible piece, but behind it, there were just years of being low-key, a spreadsheet, simple meals, being off social media, and saying no to distractions, and learning to be okay with that. When people hear leverage, they usually think of debt or borrowed money. While that can be one form of leverage, leverage is also relationships, family, timing, information, and being humble enough to learn from those around you. I didn't build my life pretending I did everything alone. I used my resources and the support around me. I listened and learned from people. I paid attention to opportunities. I let myself receive help, advice, and access when it was available. Some people may be too proud to admit that support is part of the strategy, but leverage is a virtue. I also think we have to be thoughtful about the phrase self-made. Even being born in the right country, having family nearby, or having people who can open doors for you can be forms of leverage. I think a lot of people already have that step ahead in ways they don't recognize. I think wisdom is self-awareness and knowing how to use those resources, relationships, and opportunities available to you with humility and responsibility. For me, buying my first property at 20 was not about real estate. It was about learning how sacrifice turns into capital, how capital turns into assets, and how assets can turn into options. Now, not everyone needs to rush into real estate, but everyone should understand this principle. If you could become disciplined enough to build your first real base of capital and curious enough to learn how a business actually works, you can give yourself a chance to create a very different life for you and your family. That is what I'm still learning, and that is what I want to continue documenting. I'm not here to pretend I know everything. I'm here because I'm curious about how leverage, businesses, and opportunities work and share that with you guys. And when I learn something useful, I want to share it in a way that feels clear, practical, and my honest opinion from my perspective. So that's the story about how I bought my first property at 20. It all started with musubi, ramen, a basic spreadsheet, and I just put my head down for a few years. And sometimes that's how it should be.